Hello, my name is Doug Mosier, and I'm with the Oakland Fire Safe Council. In this short video, I'm going to cover the GENOAK two-way radio network, emergency network. GENOAK stands for GMRS Emergency Network for Oakland. And before we get started, I just want to point out a couple of websites that we recommend you take a look at. The first is our GENOAK website, which is genoak.org. We have a lot of information on the website about the network itself, how radios work, what recommended radios you may want to consider if you want to become a GENOAK operator, how to go about getting your license from the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, to use your GENOAK radio, and so on. So that is all on our website, genoak.org, and we recommend that you do take a look at that and read through as much as you can. The other website is our Oakland Fire Safe Council website, oaklandfiresafecouncil.org. We have a lot of information on there as well on emergency preparedness and response, on wildfire safety, and so on. So again, hope you'll have the chance to take a look at those two sites, certainly the GENOAK website. So starting, I'm going to spend a few minutes here comparing cell phones, which I think probably most of us are familiar with, or smartphones, with a two-way radio, which many of us may not be so familiar with. So first of all, cell phones work by transmitting and receiving radio waves, and they do that with cell towers. So you need a cell tower for a cell phone or a smartphone to connect with another phone. Now, I know cell phones can transmit a short distance between each other, but in general, for any typical use, you use and have to connect with a cell tower. Two-way radios, on the other hand, well, they also use radio waves to transmit and receive conversations, but they don't need a tower. So two-way radios can talk to other two-way radios over quite a long distance without any sort of tower or device in between them. Now, two-way radios also do use towers, and they're called repeaters, and we'll talk about that in a bit. And a two-way radio repeater is used to greatly enlarge the area that two-way radio can communicate in. So again, we'll talk about that and how repeaters are used. But the important thing is here that both of these devices, a cell phone and a radio, they're both two-way radios. Cell phone needs cell tower, and a two-way radio doesn't necessarily need any kind of tower in between, but it can use one. In terms of talking or having a conversation on a cell phone versus a radio, on a cell phone, it's most often one-to-one. Yes, you can have conference calls and Zoom calls on smartphones, but in most cases, you're having a conversation with another individual whom you typically know who that is. With a two-way radio, though, the conversations are one-to-many. So when you transmit with a two-way radio, you don't really know how many people are out there listening and how many people may want to talk back with you. But it could be many. It could be many people that are listening on a particular channel or frequency on the radio. So that's again one difference between cell phones and two-way radios. Another difference is cell phone, of course, we know requires a service plan to be able to use, a monthly cost typically for that service plan. With a two-way radio, it's free. Once you have your license, and you do need a license for this type of radio, for GENOAK, from the FCC, Federal Communication Commission. But once you have that license, at that point on, there are no costs to use a two-way radio and to talk, so free to talk. Another difference between these two is that with a cell phone, of course, you use your telephone number to identify yourself, or at least to initiate a call, and each cell phone has a unique cell number that it's associated with. Radio doesn't have that concept, but you do use your call sign, which is part of your FCC license for your radio. You get a call sign, And that's how you identify yourself over a two-way radio. So it's by that call sign. We'll talk about that as well in a little bit. Another important difference here is that the cellular network may or may not work after an emergency or after a major disaster for several reasons. One, that cell phone, of course, needs the cell towers to be able to operate and communicate. And if after a major disaster, those cell towers, that cellular infrastructure is damaged, then your local cell phone might not work. And one never knows. We don't know until a major disaster hits how well the cellular system is going to hold up. Radios, on the other hand, will typically work during an emergency, and that's why police and fire and first responders still use two-way radios, because they tend to work in an emergency. Again, radios can communicate with other radios as long as they're both on the same channel or frequency and they're turned on. Then you can have that conversation over radio. It doesn't rely on that infrastructure, and so they're more likely to be operable during and after a major emergency. On the other side, cell phones, especially smartphones, of course, have a lot of capabilities in terms of connecting to the internet, running applications, transferring files, data, all those things you can do on your cell phone with that nice large screen, video data, and so on. You can't do any of that really with a two-way radio, at least not easily. So two-way radios, especially those that we use for GENOAK, do not have the ability to connect to the internet. There's no graphical display screen. You can't run apps and so on. So that is a major advantage, of course, of a mobile phone or a smartphone. Now, there are ways to transfer files or send email over two-way radio, and that's done through the ham or amateur radio service, which we'll talk about in a bit. And there are other ways to use two-way radios to send information, but for GENOAK at least, no, you can't connect to the internet and run apps and so on. So that is a plus on the cell phone side. And then both need batteries to operate, and that's pretty basic, but if you have battery power or the batteries are recharged in either cell phone or radio, then they should work just fine. If the batteries run out or the charge is depleted, then neither device is going to work. So that's a commonality between cell phones, mobile phones, and two-way radios. So I noted that in a radio conversation, it is one to many. So you can see here, one person talks at a time and everyone else listens. It's pretty much impossible with two-way radio for two or more people to talk at the same time. It happens with two-way radio quite often, but in most cases, neither party will be heard, or maybe one person will sort of overwhelm the other person. But basically, it's one person at a time talking, everyone listens, and then when the next person is ready to talk, then it's their turn. And there are ways to manage this with two-way radios, and we explain that on our website. It's through this concept of network control, net control, and basically an operator who acts as the director for different two-way radio operators when they can talk and when the next person can talk. So that's managed on a radio network, and it's something that's fairly unique but very common with two-way radios. So let's start with communicating over two-way radio within a group of individuals. So within a neighborhood, an organized neighborhood, a community, a CERT team, a hub, an apartment building, organization, and so on. So you have a group of people, any size number of people, and they all need to or want to communicate, and they want to do this on a two-way radio. So the question first is why? Why would you need to do this? Well, A lot of reasons. If you have a neighborhood group, for example, and there's an emergency, you may want to notify your other neighbors, check in on them, find out what's going on at their end of the block, provide them with information, and so on. So notification, checking in afterwards, making sure people are safe, providing assistance as needed, can again all be coordinated over two-way radio. As well as if you have a neighborhood or an incident command center or your CERT teams and you want to communicate among the teams and the command center, you can do that certainly with two-way radios. And as we noted, during and after a major disaster, again, cell phone network and internet service just may not be working for some period of time, and it could potentially be a longer period of time. It just depends on the magnitude of the disaster and how it affects the cellular network. And then these smaller groups or neighborhood groups or organizations that all connect via two-way radio are a link in a larger radio network, and we'll show that. So how would you then communicate within a group, within your neighborhood, let's say? Well, it's recommended to use what's called Family Radio Service, FRS, and that is a radio service that the FCC manages and regulates, and it's available to everyone. Anyone can purchase these relatively low-cost FRS, Family Radio Service radios. Most folks call these walkie-talkies. You don't need a license. The radios themselves are relatively inexpensive. There's a standard number of channels that the FCC again regulates. There are 22 FRS channels or frequencies, same thing with GMRS and FRS, that you can talk on. So 22 different channels. These radios are relatively low power, anywhere from a half a watt to 2 watts output. Again, that's regulated by the FCC. And that's done to intentionally keep the range of these radios relatively short. So typical range is from, say, half a mile to a mile, maybe a couple miles, depending on where you are and where the other person is that you're talking to. Things like terrain, hills, foliage, buildings, those will all limit two-way radio range because radio signals have a hard time going around or even through those buildings and trees and so on. So a mile or so is a good average for an FRS radio. Now you'll see claims on manufacturers' websites of dozens of miles of range from an FRS radio. Well, that's really only going to happen if two people are on top of a mountain and have a clear line of sight to each other. So in most cases, if you're using FRS radios in your community, in your neighborhood, in your apartment building, in a city, you're only going to get a short range of a mile or so. Again, that's not a bad thing. That's good because you're less likely to interfere with other groups, with other neighborhoods, with other hubs that are also using FRS radios internally to communicate. So that's not bad that the radio range is typically fairly short. So some radio choices for Family Radio Service, FRS. They run, you can see radios run around $25 to $30 to $40 a pair. They're usually sold in a pair. And these are FRS only radios, so they only work on the Family Radio Service radio service. And we have some recommended radios on our website, which again, genoak.org, if you look under the FRS tab. And you note you pay more for features, not range. Again, the range is regulated by the power output of these radios. The antennas are fixed, so you'll get about the same range with any of these FRS radios, but you may get some more features. You may get better weather resistance. You may get the ability to listen to NOAA weather radio on your FRS radio. You may have dual power, which can be an advantage in that you have a rechargeable battery pack, and it will take AA or AAA batteries. So you have more options for making sure your radio is powered. But again, you pay more for features, but not really for distance or range that you can talk on these FRS radios. Next, let's talk about communicating between groups, so between neighborhoods or community groups or CERT teams or hubs or apartment buildings over a wider area, a greater distance. And that, again, is something that we want to do. And why would we want to do this? Why would we want to be able to communicate between all these different neighborhoods and entities around our city and around our area? Well, one more time, cellular and landline phone service, again, may be disrupted. So the use of a cell phone to connect with people, text messaging, and so on, just may not work for some time after a major disaster. But we still need to communicate. Communications are very important during and after a major event, a major emergency. We may need to provide updates on situations, things that are happening around us. Is there a wildfire? Where is it? Are there evacuation routes that are blocked? Is there flood water in a particular area, and so on. So these types of updates can be very useful to others around us. And we can communicate that again by our two-way radios. We could also request and coordinate assistance. So maybe one neighborhood group needs special help, and they can communicate that out on their radio, and a nearby community or a CERT team could potentially provide them with that assistance. So again, communication is very important. And then mobilizing volunteers for search and rescue, for cleanup afterwards, and so on. So there are a lot of needs and a lot of reasons to be able to communicate. And two-way radios gives you one option for doing so. How would you do that? Well, you'd use a slightly different service called GMRS, and that's the GENOAK is GMRS, Emergency Network Oakland. GMRS stands for General Mobile Radio Service. It's another radio service that the FCC regulates and manages. Very similar to FRS. Actually, they are sibling radio services. GMRS gives you as well 22 channels, or those are specific frequencies, but you don't need to worry, just 22 channels. They are the same 22 channels as FRS. So GMRS and FRS share those same channels. You can talk with each other on those different radio services, no problem. GMRS adds 8 additional channels for repeaters, communicating with a repeater. I'll talk about that in a bit. With GMRS, one difference between GMRS and FRS is that you do need an FCC license and then a call sign that comes with that license to use a GMRS radio, especially if you're using it with a repeater, especially if you're using it with a network like GENOAK, which uses that repeater. So here's an example of a GMRS call sign that you get from the FCC. They give this to you when you pay your money for your license. WQOY 819, that happens to be mine. And it's very easy to get an FCC license for GMRS because you don't have to take a test. There is no exam. You just go to the FCC website, you pay them $35, that's for 10 years, and they will send you your license and your call sign that they'll assign to you. And we have the information on our website on genoak.org on how to go through that process to get your FCC GMRS license. Again, it's pretty straightforward. It's pretty easy, and it just takes a couple days. With the GMRS radio, I think we've noted, again, you can communicate radio to radio. So one or many people can talk to each other directly and over quite a bit of distance. You can With GMRS, you have a bit more power. You can put on you can attach a better antenna or a taller antenna, which makes a huge difference. And you can actually communicate over quite a distance. 20, 30 miles is not unheard of for GMRS radios to talk directly with each other. Again, if you have buildings, if you have terrain, canyon, hills in the way, that'll be shorter than that. But still, you get a pretty good distance. Or GMRS allows the use of a repeater. And that gives you even much greater distances that you can talk across. Again, the how for connecting these groups, these community groups, neighborhoods, CERT teams, hubs, and so on, is to use GENOAK. And GENOAK, again, GMRS Emergency Network for Oakland. GENOAK provides coverage throughout Oakland, so throughout pretty much the whole city, the entire city of Oakland, and much of the East Bay. GENOAK allows radio operators from Hayward down south all the way up to Richmond up north and quite a bit around the area to all talk to each other with a simple GMRS radio like you see in this picture, simple handheld radio. We have designed the GENOAK network and made it for emergency and preparedness use only. So it's not intended to be just a general way of chatting with other folks. It's really dedicated for emergency and preparedness. And we have monthly check-ins where we practice once a month, just giving our call sign and basically saying hello. And then we have exercises, drills throughout the year as well, where we can practice more of a simulated emergency. And all this information is on our website about our check-ins, and please take a look at that. GENOAK does use this thing called a repeater, and ours is called the Oakland 600 GMRS repeater. And before we get into that, some radio choices, GMRS radio choices. So here are a few. They're generally a little bit more expensive than an FRS radio, maybe $35, $45, $50 and then up. You can spend quite a bit more for a mobile radio. That's the radio on the right-hand side. It has more power. It generally has more features. It has a separate keypad, the microphone that you can talk into. But for GENOAK, again, around our Bay Area and especially Oakland, you can generally use the GENOAK network just fine with any of these handheld radios like the first three on this page. One thing to note is that a GMRS radio must be what's called repeater capable. So it needs to be able to work with a repeater. And pretty much all new GMRS radios within the past couple of years do work with repeaters just fine, and the ones we have listed here. Older radios, you may have some, a Radio Shack radio or an older Motorola or Uniden radios that were called FRS, GMRS. They were kind of combined at that time before 2017. So those older radios generally will not work with GENOAK because they are not repeater capable. So apologize for that, but you will need to purchase a newer, more modern GMRS radio. One thing to note is that, I think I noted this before, is that the family radio service, the lower powered radios you would typically use within a group, they can communicate just fine with the GMRS radio. Again, those 22 channels are shared. They're the same frequency, so if a GMRS and an FRS radio are on the same channel, the two individuals can talk to each other. We do have on our GENOAK website a page just on GMRS radios. That's the radios tab, and we have recommendations and information on various aspects of GMRS radios, what you may want to choose, and some more information. So please check that out. Okay, types of radio communications. Well, we've been talking about radio to radio, so one radio or maybe many radios all talking to each other directly. That's called simplex in radio speak, simplex, if you hear that. So that may be someone with a GMRS radio talking to somebody else with a GMRS radio on channel 1, let's just say. And it's just direct communications between the two radios. And again, this may work on a GMRS radio up to a few miles or maybe longer, depending on where you are, where both people are, and if there's anything blocking that radio signal. Also, FRS, the FRS radios can talk with GMRS, like we noted. Again, that's simplex, talking radio to radio. And then we have this thing called the repeater, which we've been mentioning. So let's cover that. A repeater is basically what its name implies. It takes your radio signal or your transmission, and it repeats it over a very wide area, a large area. So for example, our GENOAK system uses a repeater for GMRS that covers the East Bay, and I noted that. So it's not only Oakland, but a good chunk of the East Bay. So looking at the diagram, you can see the repeater on the left-hand side. A repeater is nothing more than a radio. It's actually two radios connected to each other, but it's a radio that usually is up in a very high location, so it has a great line of sight, and it typically has more power than your handheld radios. And the way it works is, for example, the person using the yellow radio, when they transmit on the repeater channel, so in this case on the GENOAK channel, the GENOAK repeater up there on the hill hears that, and it turns around and repeats that transmission. It repeats the voice back out over a much wider area. And again, it can do that because it's up high. Our GENOAK repeater, for example, is up on the Oakland Hills, the top of the ridge of the Oakland Hills, so it has a great height and a great line of sight around the Bay Area. And it's fairly powerful. So it's a 50-watt transmitter in that GENOAK repeater, so it can transmit quite a bit of distance. So you can see again from this diagram how a repeater helps that people to communicate with each other. For example, the yellow radio trying to communicate with the person on the radio on the far right side, direct simplex radio to radio might not work too well. You've got trees and foliage, you've got hills and terrain that's in the way, you might have buildings and so on. So those two radios, the one on the left and the one on the right, may have a difficult time communicating or not at all. But using the repeater, you can see that the repeater can reach that radio on the right-hand side because it's up high and it's more powerful. And with that repeater, then the person in the yellow radio can talk to any of these other radios in this diagram much better than if they're trying to go radio to radio or simplex. So that's why you use a repeater. It covers a much wider area and gives you more range. And then just to note that yes, you do need a GMRS repeater capable radio to talk to GENOAK. Again, we have those recommended on our website. But anybody with an FRS radio or an older GMRS radio can listen in, and that's called monitor, can listen in to the GENOAK repeater. So even if you have an FRS radio at home, an old one you have, you can listen to what's going on across the GENOAK repeater just by tuning into channel 17. Just want to make that note. So here is our antenna for the GENOAK repeater. Again, I noted it's up on the ridge top in the Oakland Hills, quite high, and then the antenna itself is quite high, the tower. And our GENOAK antenna is the one in the middle there toward the top. But that is the repeater tower. GENOAK operators. So we have quite a few now. We started GENOAK in 2021. And since then, we have about 170 folks that are using GENOAK, that have GENOAK radios, that have at least connected to the GENOAK repeater. They know they can, and many of them will practice on our regular monthly check-ins. So you can see on this map, the concentration is in Oakland, of course, but we do have folks up in Berkeley and up toward Richmond, El Cerrito, and down south as well that are that have the radio and that are GENOAK operators and that can communicate. So everybody here can communicate with each other, certainly during and after a disaster, via GENOAK, and again share information, status, make requests, do damage assessments, and so on, again using the GENOAK network. You can also see that there are some pretty big areas of Oakland, East and West Oakland particularly, that don't yet have GENOAK operators in those areas, and we certainly want to. So any help you can provide in getting more people, especially in East Oakland and West Oakland, using GENOAK would be appreciated. There is the GENOAK repeater. You can see again that it's up on top of the ridge, and it has great coverage of Oakland and much of the East Bay on this side of the Oakland Hills and Berkeley Hills. Besides GENOAK, we have other GMRS radio networks around us. We have CERT, which is Berkeley's CERT neighborhood network for GMRS, so they have a repeater in Berkeley. We partner with them. We each check in on the other's repeaters in case in or after an emergency one of our repeaters happen to be damaged. We could use the other as a backup, so that's a good plan. Lafayette, Moraga, Orinda, they actually have 3 GMRS repeaters, one in each of those towns. And they practice their CERT check-ins and exercises and drills as well with their own GMRS repeaters that we can access. Certainly the Orinda repeater is convenient to us here in Oakland. And then Richmond and Richmond Marina Bay also have very active CERT organizations that use two-way radios, GMRS, for their exercises and their drills and their monthly check-in. So there are, again, other GMRS networks that are around us. We all work with each other, and we can typically connect with each other as well, which is good because a disaster knows no city boundary, right? A wildfire, earthquake, it's not going to stop at Oakland, or it's not going to stop at Berkeley. So the ability to communicate with people around us in other towns certainly can be very advantageous. I'm going to touch a little bit on amateur radio, or it's also known as ham radio, and the aspect of ham radio for emergency communications and how that relates to GENOAK. So ham radio, again, amateur ham, same thing. It's a different radio service that's also managed and regulated by the FCC. It's a step up, certainly, from GMRS. In many cases, it's a big step up from GMRS. ham gives you many more capabilities in terms of distance that you can communicate. That ham radio, the large one, you can use that with the right antenna to talk with people pretty much around the world, which you really can't do with GMRS, of course. GMRS is just a local repeater area. But in terms of local communications, whether it's ham or GMRS, ham uses a repeater as well, very similar to the GMRS. GENOAK repeater works the same way. And in terms of communicating by voice in our area, ham and GMRS or GENOAK are comparable. So you can think of them as sort of 2 parallel networks. Now with ham radios, you have many more frequencies that you can talk on. Those are in different bands of frequencies. So many, many more than the 22 that you have with GMRS or FRS. And with ham radio, you do need an FCC license as well, and you do get a call sign. KI6DOG, for example, is my call sign. With ham radio, you do need to take an exam. So there is a test that's managed by radio clubs through the FCC, and you do have to pass that exam. And there are 2-3 different levels of ham radio operators license that you can get. Each one requires an exam. It's not difficult, certainly, it just takes a little bit of effort to study for it. And it's recommended as well, if that's something that's of interest to you, to get your ham radio license as well. Ham has a service called RACES, Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service. It's a nationwide program that fosters ham radio operators being able to connect for emergencies, to handle emergency information and traffic, and assist local agencies in communications if needed. So that's called RACES. There's a similar one called ARES, ARES. It's another very similar emergency service. And as I noted before, you can transmit certain data. So you can send email, you can transmit files, images using ham radio. It's quite slow compared with high-speed internet, for sure, but it can be done. And there's a couple different also other ways of using two-way radio, mesh network to transmit information, but we're not going to get into that. But let's get into the emergency network that we have here in and around Oakland and the East Bay. So ORCA is the Oakland Radio Communication Association. That's the ham radio club for Oakland. There are a lot of ham radio operators. There is a ham repeater, ORCA repeater. It is also up on top of the Oakland Hills Ridge, very close to the GENOAK repeater. And again, it works in pretty much the same way as any repeater. It allows ham radio operators anywhere within Oakland or the Bay Area, East Bay for sure, to be able to communicate with each other. So it's a basic repeater. And then Oakland, the city of Oakland has their emergency operations center that's managed by their Office of Emergency Services or Emergency Management Services Division. That emergency operations center is in Fire Station number 1 on MLK in the city of Oakland. And at that EOC, that is where during a disaster, a major emergency, that emergency services and different representatives of the Oakland city government and other agencies and entities would come together in that center and be able to direct response operations to the emergency. So the EOC can communicate with Oakland fire stations and 911 and emergency services and so on. So that is our emergency operations center for Oakland, the EOC. Now, I mentioned RACES. There is a RACES network in Oakland, and that is used by certain ham radio operators, those who have been had some training in RACES, to be able to connect with a radio that is located in the emergency operations center. So there's a radio room with some ham radio equipment in there, and soon GMRS radio equipment, GENOAK. But hams can connect and pass information, so critical information during an emergency, and that can get into individuals within that emergency operations center and then passed out to others in the city to respond to. So that's in place, and we hold drills and annual exercises to test this, and it's been around for a while. So now let's just talk about connecting GENOAK in Oakland with the ham radio group, and that connection is there. So we saw this diagram already. This is GENOAK with the repeater at the top and GENOAK radio operators being able to communicate with each other. over that repeater and in their respective groups, their community groups, their CERT teams, their hubs, their apartments, whatever. And those individual groups would communicate within their own entity using those FRS radios typically. And then again, the GMRS radio or GENOAK would connect all those different groups together throughout our area. And then we just talked about a similar network with ham radio or amateur radio that uses its own repeater. And that has the ability to connect to the Emergency Operations Center. So then we have this idea of utilizing what are called net liaison operators, and that is simply a radio operator who has both a ham radio and a GENOAK GMRS radio. And there are many of these individuals, and they can transfer information from the GENOAK network up through the RACES network and then over to the Emergency Operations Center. So this is a way that neighborhood groups can get critical messages to Oakland's Emergency Operations Center if, for example, the cell phone network is not working and 911 is not available. The radio system through GENOAK and through the amateur ham, two different networks can pass those critical messages to the Emergency Operations Center. So this is in place. We test this, and it does work. And it opens up even, I noted before, a link in the larger radio network. Well, that's the link from individuals to their neighborhood groups, CERT teams, all the way up through the Oakland ham repeater, through RACES to the Emergency Operations Center. So messages can be transmitted in that way. Okay, that is all, and we welcome any questions you might have. Certainly you can send an email or leave a message on our phone number there. And again, recommended that you visit our website at genoak.org. This information is all on our website, plus much more. But if at any time you have any questions, if you would like a radio recommendation, or when you get your radio, how do you connect to the GENOAK network, we're happy to help you with that and answer those questions. So thank you very much, and we hope to hear you on the GENOAK network. Bye-bye.